Well, hello there. I'm Jason Kishinev, and welcome back to A People's Historian, where we read about 30 minutes of history together every episode. We are about to start Chapter 13 in A People's History of the United States, written by Howard Zinn, and let's just dig in. Chapter 13, The Socialist Challenge. War and jingoism. War and jingoism might postpone, but could not fully suppress the class anger that came from the realities of ordinary life. As the 20th century opened, the anger re-emerged. Emma Goldman, the anarchist and feminist, whose political consciousness was shaped by factory work, the Haymarket executions, the Homestead strike, the long prison term of her lover and comrade Alexander Berkman, and the depression of the 1890s, the strike struggles of New York, her own imprisonment on Blackwell's Island, spoke at a meeting some years after the Spanish-American War. How our hearts burned with indignation against the atrocious Spaniards, but when the smoke was over, the dead buried, and the cost of the war came back to the people in an increase in the price of commodities and rent. That is, when we sobered up from our patriotic spree, it suddenly dawned on us that the cause of the Spanish-American War was the price of sugar. That the lives, blood, and money of the American people were used to protect the interests of the American capitalists. Mark Twain was neither an anarchist nor a radical. By 1900, at 65, he was a world-acclaimed writer of funny, serious American to-the-bone stories. He watched the United States and other Western countries go about the war and wrote in the New York Herald as the century began, "I bring you the stately matron named Christendom, returning bedraggled, besmirched, and dishonored from pirate raids in Chpt, Manchuria, South Africa, and the Philippines, with her soul full of meanness, her pocket full of boodle, and her mouth full of pious hypocrisies." There were writers of the early 20th century who spoke for socialism, or criticized the capitalist system harshly, not obscure pamphleteers, but among the most famous of American literary figures, whose books were read by millions. Upton Sinclair, Jack London, Theodore Dreiser, Frank Norris. Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle, published in 1906, brought the conditions in the meatpacking plants of Chicago to the shocked attention of the whole country and stimulated demand for laws regulating the meat industry. But although, through the story of an immigrant laborer, Jurgis Rudkus, it spoke of socialism, of how beautiful life might be if people cooperatively owned and worked and shared the riches of the earth. The Jungle was first published in the socialist newspaper Appeal to Reason. It was then read by millions as a book and was translated into 17 languages. One of the influences on Upton Sinclair's thinking was a book, People of the Abyss, by Jack London. London was a member of the Socialist Party. He had come out of the slums of San Francisco, the child of an unwed mother. He had been a newsboy, a cannery worker, a sailor, a fisherman, had worked in a jute mill and a laundry, hoboed the railroads to the East Coast, been clubbed by a policeman on the streets of New York, and arrested for vagrancy in Niagara Falls, watched men beaten and tortured in jail, pirated oysters in San Francisco Bay, read Flaubert, Tolstoy, Melville, and the Communist Manifesto, preached socialism in the Alaskan gold camps in the winter of 1896, sailed 2,000 miles back through the Bering Sea, and became a world-famous writer of adventure books. In 1906, he wrote his novel the Iron Heel, with its warning of a fascist America, its ideal of a socialist brotherhood of man. In the course of it, through his characters, he indicts the system. In the face of the facts that modern man lives more wretchedly than the caveman, and that his producing power is 1,000 times greater than that of the caveman, no other conclusion is possible than that the capitalist class has mismanaged, criminally and selfishly mismanaged. And with this attack division, let us not destroy those wonderful machines that produce efficiently and cheaply. Let us control them. Let us profit by their efficiency and cheapness. Let us run them for ourselves. That, gentlemen, is socialism. It was a time when even a self-exiled literary figure living in Europe and not prone to political statements, the novelist Henry James, could tour the United States in 1904 and see the country as a huge rappaccini garden, rank with each variety of the poison plant of the money passion. Muckrakers, who raked up the mud and the muck, contributed to the atmosphere of dissent by simply telling what they saw. Some of the new mass circulation magazines, ironically enough in the interest of profit, printed their articles. Ida Tarbell's exposure of the Standard Oil Company, Lincoln Steffen's stories of corruption in the major American cities. By 1900, neither the patriotism of the war nor the absorption of energy in elections could disguise the troubles of the system. The process of business concentration had gone forward. The control by bankers had become more clear. As technology developed and corporations became larger, they needed more capital. And it was the bankers who had this capital. Man, does this sound like right now, doesn't it? This is over 100 years ago. By 1904, more than 1,000 railroad lines had been consolidated into 6 great combinations. And in today's society, all of 1,000 newspapers, magazines, local television stations, and radio stations have all been consolidated into 6 corporations. We're repeating history, don't you see? All right, let's do that again. By 1904, more than 1,000 railroad lines had been consolidated into 6 great combinations, each allied with either Morgan or Rockefeller interests. As Cochrane and Miller say, the imperial leader of the new oligarchy was the House of Morgan. In its operations, it was ably assisted by the First National Bank of New York, directed by George F. Baker, and the National City Bank of New York, presided over by James Stillman, agent of the Rockefeller interests. Among them, these 3 men and their financial associates occupied 341 directorships in 112 great corporations. The total resources of these corporations in 1912 was $22 billion, $245 million. More than the assessed value of all property in the 22 states and territories west of the Mississippi River. $22 billion, $245 million. That was so much money back then. I mean, that's an absurd amount of money now. And it was so much more then. I mean, that's gotta be like worth trillions in today's, adjusted for inflation. Morgan had always wanted regularity, stability, predictability. An associate of his said in 1901, with a man like Mr. Morgan at the head of a great industry, as against the old plan of many diverse interests in it, production would become more regular, labor would be more steadily employed at better wages, and panics caused by overproduction would become a thing of the past. But even Morgan and his associates were not in complete control of such a system. In 1907, there was a panic financial collapse and crisis. True, the very big businesses were not hurt, but profits after 1907 were not as high as capitalists wanted. Industry was not expanding as fast as it might, and industrialists began to look for ways to cut costs. One way was Taylorism. Frederick W. Taylor had been a steel company foreman who closely analyzed every job in the mill and worked out a system of finely detailed division of labor, increased mechanization, and piecework wage systems to increase production and profits. In 1911, he published a book on scientific management that became powerfully influential in the business world. Now management can control every detail of the worker's energy and time in the factory. Oh joy! As Harry Braverman said, the purpose of Taylorism was to make workers interchangeable, able to do the simple tasks that the new division of labor required, like standard parts divested of individuality and humanity, bought and sold as commodities. Sounds like a great plan. It was a system well fitted for the new auto industry. Yeah. In 1909, Ford sold 10,607 autos. In 1913, 168,000. In 1914, 248,000. 45% of all autos produced. The profit, $30 million. With immigrants, a larger proportion of the labor force in the Carnegie plants of Allegheny County in 1907, of the 14,359 common laborers, 11,694 were Eastern Europeans. Taylorism, with its simplified, unskilled jobs, became more feasible. In New York City, the new immigrants went to work in the sweatshops. The poet Edwin Markham wrote in Cosmopolitan magazine, January 1907, in unaired rooms, mothers and fathers sew by day and by night. Those in the home sweatshop must work cheaper than those in the factory sweatshops, and the children are called in from play to drive and drudge beside their elders. All the year in New York and in other cities, you may watch children radiating to and from such pitiful homes. Nearly any hour on the east side of New York City, you can see them. Pallid boy or spindling girl, their faces dulled, their backs bent under a heavy load of garments piled on head and shoulders, the muscles of the whole frame in a long strain. Is it not a cruel civilization that allows little hearts and little shoulders to strain under these grown-up responsibilities, while in the same city a pet cur is jeweled and pampered and aired on a fine lady's velvety lap on the beautiful boulevards? The city became a battlefield. On August 10th, 1905, the New York Tribune reported that a strike at Fetterman's Bakery on the Lower East Side led to violence when Fetterman used scab labor to continue producing. Strikers or their sympathizers wrecked the bake shop of Philip Fetterman at number 183 Orchard Street early last night amid scenes of the most tumultuous excitement. Policemen smashed heads right and left with their nightsticks after two of their number had been roughly dealt with by the mob. There were 500 garment facilities in New York. A woman later recalled the conditions of work. Dangerously broken stairways, windows few and so dirty, the wooden floors that were swept once a year, hardly any other light but the gas jets burning by day and by night, the filthy, malodorous lavatory in the dark hall, no fresh drinking water, mice and roaches. During the winter months, how we suffered from the cold. In the summer, we suffered from the heat. In these disease-breeding holes, we, the youngsters, together with the men and women, toiled for from 70 and 80 hours a week, Saturdays and Sundays included. A sign would go up on Saturday afternoon. If you don't come in on Sunday, you need not come in on Monday. Children's dreams of a day off shattered. We wept, for after all, we were only children. At the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in the winter of 1909, women organized and decided to strike. Soon they were walking the picket line in the cold, knowing they would not win while the other factories were operating. A mass meeting was called of workers in the other shops, and Clara Lemlich, in her teens, an eloquent speaker, still hearing the signs of her recent beating on the picket line, stood up. I offer a resolution that a general strike be declared now. The meeting went wild. They voted to strike. Pauline Newman, one of the strikers, recalled years later the beginning of the general strike. Thousands upon thousands left the factories from every side, all of them walking down toward Union Square. It was November. The cold winter was just around the corner. We had no fur coats to keep warm, and yet there was the spirit that led us on and on until we got to some hall. I can see the young people, mostly women, walking down and not caring what might happen. The hunger, cold, loneliness. They just didn't care on that particular day. That was their day. The union had hoped 3,000 would join the strike. 20,000 walked out. Every day 1,000 new members joined the union. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which before this had few women. How could the International Ladies Garment Workers Union have few women? Colored women were active in the strike, which went on through the winter, against police, against scabs, against arrests and prison. In more than 300 shops, workers won their demands. Women now became officials in the union. Pauline Newman again. We tried to educate ourselves. I would invite the girls to my rooms, and we took turns reading poetry in English to improve our understanding of the language. One of our favorites was Thomas Hood's Song of the Shirt, and another, Percy Bysshe Shelley's Mask of Anarchy. Rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. The conditions in the factories did not change much. On the afternoon of March 25th, 1911, a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company that began in a rag bin swept through the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors, too high for fire ladders to reach. The fire chief of New York had said that his ladders could reach only the 7th floor, but half of New York's 500,000 workers spent all day, perhaps 12 hours, above the 7th floor. The laws said factory doors had to open outward, but at the Triangle Company, the doors opened in. The law said the doors could not be locked during working hours, but at the Triangle Company, doors were usually locked so the company could keep track of the employees. And so, trapped, the young women were burned to death at their work tables, or jammed against the locked exit door, or leaped to their deaths down the elevator shafts. The New York World reported, screaming men and women and boys and girls crowded out on the many window ledges and threw themselves into the streets far below. They jumped with their clothing ablaze. The hair of some of the girls streamed up aflame as they leaped. Thud after thud sounded on the pavements. It is a ghastly fact that on both the Green Street and Washington Place sides of the building, there grew mounds of the dead and dying. From opposite windows, spectators saw again and again pitiable companionships formed in the instant of death. Girls who placed their arms around each other as they leaped. When it was over, 146 triangle workers, mostly women, were burned or crushed to death. There was a memorial parade down Broadway, and 100,000 marched. There were more fires and accidents and sickness. In the year 1904, 27,000 workers were killed on the job in manufacturing, transport, and agriculture. In 1 year, 50,000 accidents took place in New York factories alone. Hat and cap makers were getting respiratory diseases. Quarrymen were inhaling deadly chemicals. Lithographic printers were getting arsenic poisoning. A New York State Factory Investigation Commission reported in 1912. Sadie is an intelligent, neat, clean girl who has worked from the time she got her working papers in embroidery factories. In her work, she was accustomed to use a white powder, chalk or talcum as was usual, which was brushed over the perforated designs and thus transferred to the cloth. The design was easily brushed off when made of chalk or of talcum. Her last employer, therefore, commenced using white lead powder mixed with rosin, which cheapened the work as the powder could not be rubbed off and necessitate restamping. None of the girls knew of the change in powder nor of the danger in its use. Sadie had been a very strong, healthy girl, good appetite and color. She began to be unable to eat. Her hands and feet swelled. She lost the use of one hand. Her teeth and gums were blue. When she finally had to stop work after being treated for months for stomach trouble, her physician advised her to go to a hospital. There the examination revealed the fact that she had lead poisoning. According to a report of the Commission on Industrial Relations in 1914, 35,000 workers were killed in industrial accidents and 700,000 injured. That year, the income of 44 families making $1 million or more equaled the total income of 100,000 families earning $500 a year. The record shows an exchange between Commissioner Harris Weinstock of the Commission on The record shows an exchange between Commissioner Harris Weinstock of the Commission on Industrial Relations and President John Osgood, head of a Colorado coal company controlled by the Rockefellers. Weinstock: if a worker loses his life, are his dependents compensated in any way? Osgood: not necessarily. In some cases they are, and in some cases not. Weinstock: if he is crippled for life, is there any compensation? Osgood: no, sir, there is none. Weinstock: then the whole burden is thrown directly upon their shoulders. Osgood: yes, sir. Weinstock: the industry bears none of it? Osgood: no, the industry bears none of it. Unionization was growing. Shortly after the turn of the century, there were 2 million members of labor unions, 1 in 14 workers, 80% of them in the American Federation of Labor. The AFL was an exclusive union, almost all male, almost all white, almost all skilled workers. Although the number of women workers kept growing, it doubled from 4 million in 1890 to 8 million in 1910. And women were 1/5 of the labor force. Only 1 in 100 belonged to a union. Black workers in 1910 made 1/3 of the earnings of white workers. Although Samuel Gompers head of the AFL, would make speeches about its belief in equal opportunity, the Negro was excluded from most AFL unions. Gompers kept saying he did not want to interfere with the internal affairs of the South. I regard the race problems as one with which you people of the Southland will have to deal, without the interference, too, of meddlers from the outside. In the reality of struggle, rank-and-file workers overcame these separations from time to time. Foner quotes Mary McDowell's account of the formation of a women's union in the Chicago stockyards. It was a dramatic occasion on that evening when an Irish girl at the door called out, "A colored sister asks admission. What shall I do with her?" And the answer came from the Irish young woman in the chair, "Admit her, of course, and let all you give her a hearty welcome." In New Orleans in 1907, a general strike on the levees involving 10,000 workers, longshoremen, teamsters, freight handlers, black and white, lasted 20 days. The head of the Negro longshoremen, E.S. Swan, said, "The whites and Negroes were never before so strongly cemented in a common bond, and in my 39 years of experience on the levee, I never saw such solidarity. In all the previous strikes, the Negro was used against the white man, but that condition is now past, and both races are standing together for their common interests." These were exceptions. In general, the Negro was kept out of the trade union movement. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in 1913, "The net result of all this had been to convince the American Negro that his greatest enemy is not the employer who robs him, but his fellow white working man." Racism was practical for the AFL. The exclusion of women and foreigners was also practical. These were mostly unskilled workers and These were mostly unskilled workers, and the AFL, confined mostly to skilled workers, was based on the philosophy of business unionism. In fact, the chief official of each AFL union was called the business agent, trying to match the monopoly of production by the employer with the monopoly of workers by the union. In this way, it won better conditions for some workers and left most workers out. AFL officials drew large salaries, hobnobbed with employers, even moved in high society. A press dispatch from Atlantic City, New Jersey, the fashionable seaside resort in the summer of 1910, engaged in a game of bathing suit baseball with President Sam Gompers, Secretary Frank Morrison, and other leaders of the AFL on the beach this morning. John Mitchell, former head of the Mine Workers Union, lost a $1,000 diamond ring presented to him by his admirers after the settlement of the big Pennsylvania coal strike. Captain George Burke, a veteran lifeguard, found the ring, whereupon Mitchell peeled a $100 bill from a roll he carried in his pocket and handed it to the captain as a reward for his find. The well-paid leaders of the AFL were protected from criticism by tightly controlled meetings and by goon squads, hired toughs originally used against strikebreakers, but after a while used to intimidate and beat up opponents inside the union. In this situation, terrible conditions of labor, exclusivity in union organization, working people wanting radical change, seeing the root of misery in the capitalist system, moved toward a new kind of labor union. One morning in June 1905, there met in a hall in Chicago a convention of 200 socialists, anarchists, and radical trade unionists from all over the United States. They were forming the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. Big Bill Haywood, a leader of the Western Federation of Miners, recalled in his autobiography that he picked up a piece of board that lay on the platform and used it for a gavel to open the convention. Fellow workers, this is the Continental Congress of the working class. We are here to confederate the workers of this country into a working class movement that shall have for its purpose the emancipation of the working class from the slave bondage of capitalism. The aims and objects of this organization shall be to put the working class in possession of the economic power, the means of life, in control of the machinery of production and distribution without regard to the capitalist masters. On the speaker's platform with Haywood were Eugene Debs, leader of the Socialist Party, and Mother Mary Jones, a 75-year-old white-haired woman who was an organizer for the United Mine Workers of America. The convention drew up a constitution whose preamble said, "The working class and the employing class have nothing in common. There can be no peace so long as hunger and want are found among millions of working people, and the few who make up the employing class have all the good things of life. Between these two classes, a struggle must go on until all the toilers come together on the political as well as on the industrial field and take and hold that which they produce by their labor through an economic organization of the working class without affiliation with any political party." One of the IWW pamphlets explained why it broke with the AFL idea of craft unions. The Directory of Unions of Chicago shows in 1903 a total of 56 different unions in the packing houses, divided up still more in 14 different national trades unions of the American Federation of Labor. What a horrible example of an army divided against itself in the face of a strong combination of employers. And we'll finish up there for this episode. I want to thank you for joining me. Hope you'll tune in next time, and I hope you'll hit that like and subscribe button. Hit that notification bell as well, and you'll be notified each time I make a new video. Also, YouTube has been known to unsubscribe people, so the notification bell is a really good idea. And we'll see you next time.